Now, for the agenda today, what we're going to work on is understanding the responsibility of the frontline staff. I'll have to say one of the drawbacks to doing a webinar is I don't really know who the attendees are, what their positions in the banks are, if they're in banks or if they're other financial institutions, or what their actual job function is. So some of you might be frontline staff, some of you might be back office staff, some of you might be managers, but I'm going to try to take this from the aspect of I want you to understand what the frontline staff how they should interact with customers, what kind of questions they should be asking the customers to build a customer profile so that you know what would be suspicious because you know you've established what's normal, and also just the interaction between the back office. So when I talk about frontline staff, I'm talking mainly about tellers, account opening personnel, new account clerks, customer service personnel, kind of generally any staff that deals with a customer when they come in. Now, this is both when they open up accounts or when they come in to conduct activity. The second part we're going to talk about is training techniques for the front line, and I'm going to stress the fact that when frontline staff receives training, the training should be in conjunction with training into back office AML staff, just so both sides of the equation understand what the other side does. I'm also going to give you just a little mini BSA breakdown, just so some of you all fully understand what we're talking about when we discuss AML and why these questions are so important. And I'm going to stress right now that the major reason that that staff of a bank or an institution ask customers information is the bank's required to know your customer, KYC, and CDD in order to build up a profile of a customer's anticipated activity. So if you know what's anticipated, then you'll know what's suspicious, and therefore you can comply with the laws that require institutions to report suspicious activity. So all of this we're going to talk about today has to do with enabling a bank to gather information and ask customers for it so they can build a customer profile. So the training aspect, as a matter of fact, we're going to talk about formal training, informal training, on the job, computer training, self-study, lecture, or even webinars like this today. We're going to review some basic AML information, and we're going to talk about what kind of questions frontline staff can ask to update a customer's profile. And I just discussed about KYC and CDD. Now, I'll warn you right now that a lot of customers are going to get very offended when you start asking them questions about their account because they're not used to it. In the old days, somebody came and opened up an account, you maybe showed an ID card, and that was all that was required. Banks might ask for your name and for your address and your social in order to file some other, keep in contact with you, but there weren't actual requirements by law as to what a bank had to get. But I tell everybody that it's not pre-9/11 anymore. All the laws and regulations have changed, and I'm sorry, but the law is the law is the law, and if the law requires an institution to gather information, then a bank or an institution is required to get it. I'm also going to talk about when are some good instances of when you can ask questions. Frontline staff is a little bit hesitant to be kind of nosy or intrusive or bossy. So if you have an idea about what's a good time frame of when to ask a question, that might relieve some of your anxiety and stress. So we're going to talk about some transactions where you might want to ask a question. We're going to talk about the fact that you should always be not accusatory or nosy, but just you're asking questions to fully understand the customer transaction and relationship. Other things we're going to talk about today are asking questions about the transaction. And in the back of your mind as an account, as a frontline staff, does what transpired make sense, and can you be conversational when you ask questions? And I say again, not to be probing or intrusive, but you want to be conversational when you discuss these things with your customer. I don't know about most of you all, but whenever I go into my bank, when they ask a lot of questions, I start getting nervous. Not that I've done anything, but the idea is, well, wait a minute, I'm an honest guy. Why are you asking me all these questions? Also, when you're frontline staff, when you ask questions, keep in mind, too, the overall history of the customer's activity. It's this day and age with computer databases and customer databases, it's possible for an institution to review prior transactions in real time at a moment's notice, look at different kind of amounts that the activity occurred, locations where it happened, recurring transactions, same amount, same names. I don't think customers realize that most of us nowadays do electronic banking. Well, when you use your cell phone to contact your bank, I don't think people realize this, but the bank, the IP address or whatever servers it's on, it knows exactly where you were, what time you contacted it, what day of the week it was, and there's generally a record of what transpired. So like, for example, a lot of illegal activity can be done from overseas, but if the bank wanted to, they could go back and research the IP addresses and the server and find out, well, wait a minute, our customer was over in dysfunctional country like Cyprus or the Caymans or the British Virgin Islands, and they were conducting transactions. That seems a little bit suspicious. So a lot of bankers don't realize that they can get that information too. We're going to talk also about how BSA issues can affect your institution. I've got 3 or 4 cases at the back of the presentation today that point out instances where financial institutions paid large fines because their staff did not ask the questions to get the proper information for the bank to understand a customer's activity. So therefore, when a SAR was not filed, it was the bank's fault because they did not gather information to realize what was suspicious. And when you talk about fines, this third bullet point about how BSA can affect your institution, people think fines are a cost of doing business. Well, this day and age, the government, when they impose a fine for an AML issue, they do it after everything else has been processed. So it used to be a bank would just say, okay, cost of doing business, it's an expense, no big deal. Well, no, now it comes directly out of profits. And in addition to having a fine levied on your institution, people forget the fact that, okay, if a regulator has a problem with your AML process, they're going to have you go back and have another review by an outside vendor. They're probably going to have you conduct an audit. So it's going to cost you a lot more money to do that second review, and think about the time that your staff has to spend again to have this done again. So just because you get a fine and pay it, that's not the end of the story. No, there are look-backs, reviews, extra audits, and it can cost you up into the millions of dollars. An important part we're going to talk about too is building the relationship between the frontline staff and the back office BSA department. And I'm going to use BSA, AML interchangeably. But people don't realize that a lot of times the frontline staff are usually the newer, younger people who everybody thinks are still learning the ropes and have to be told everything, as opposed to the back office, which is a lot of the older people that have been around a while, your analysts and your reviewers. Well, both sides need to get over the fact that they think they're most important. No, you're a team working for your institution, so you want to make sure your institution does not have any issues. So both the frontline staff and the back office need to work together. And so some of the things to work together is, train together, find out what each office does. I'm sure the frontline staff has no idea how the back office uses all the information they gather. And by the same token, the back office doesn't understand how difficult it is to sit there and ask somebody for this information over and over again. So you need to make sure that you train together, you work together, and you try to prevent any kind of problems before they happen between the two groups. I'm a big proponent of also having the two departments kind of change jobs or job share sometimes, so that each department, each section understands what and how the other one operates, so it just kind of flows a little bit easier. Next slide is going to point out some actual responsibilities of the front line. Now this may seem pretty basic, but it's really kind of important information. So the frontline staff is the person that conducts the transaction. Like I walk into my bank and I go past a row of offices where all the quote officers work, and I go to the teller line. Well, that's the frontline staff. That's the person with whom I deal. She usually asks me questions. Now sometimes, yes, she'll refer me to an account officer, but generally speaking, the frontline staff, the teller back there, is with whom I deal. And I deal with a very, very small branch, so all I do is deposit checks and withdraw money. But if you went to the head office, downtown, whatever city you're in, you're going to walk in and there'll be a whole bunch of people sitting there that are your account opening people, your customer service people, and that's frontline staff also. So the first thing the frontline staff does is they conduct the transactions, and they're the ones responsible for gathering information. Bullet point number 2, they ask for information and details of a transaction that may be important. So here's a prime example. I travel a lot on my job. I go to this African country, Liberia. When I set up my banking profile, I had no idea I would be going to Liberia. Well, when I came back once, I had to wire some money back to the hotel to pay the bill. And when I started doing the wire, the bank officer looked at me and said, well, wait a minute, why are you sending a wire to Liberia? That's not in your profile. That's not the norm for you. So I sat there and explained to him that the hotel would not accept my credit card, but they did trust me to come back to the States with a form to fill out and send them the wire. But the point being is that was a great time when I was doing this transaction that wasn't in my profile for the bank to ask questions as to what transaction I was doing to see if it was suspicious or not. Now, one of the responsibilities of the front line also is to maintain a positive business relationship. End of the day, an institution wants to keep all of the customers it has, and they don't want their customer to go somewhere else. Up until about 15 or 20 years ago, each different kind of bank regulator, be it the FDIC, the Federal Reserve, state bankers, or the OCC, where I work, the Office of Control of the Currency, we examine national banks. Each one of those agencies, and the National Credit Union, each one of those agencies had their own regulations and procedures to ensure that those institutions they regulated were following the rules. Well, let's just say, for example, that maybe I, as an OCC examiner, was a lot more, our procedures were a lot more detailed and thorough, and I was a little bit more of a hard taskmaster. Well, I make the bank follow all the rules. The bank makes the customer follow all the rules. Well, there were cases sometimes back in the day where a customer would say, you know, the state bank down the street does not ask for all this information. I'm going to close my account and go down there. Well, as a result of that, all the regulators kind of got together and they formed this group called the Federal Financial Institution Enforcement Council, the FFIEC. And that group got together and they developed standard procedures so that every regulator would ask the same kind of questions from every institution. Therefore, a customer can't say, well, OCC, you're being too strict, I'm going to a state bank. And by the way, if you all haven't before, if you go online to FFIEC, and I think it's .org, or it could be .gov. They've got some great manuals in there that will help you do your job better. There's a whole bunch of AML publications in there. But there's a document called the FFIEC, I think it's called the BSA Examination Manual, which has everything you'd ever want to know about AML, BSA, terrorist financing. And a lot of the information from this presentation today, as a matter of fact, I got from that FFIEC manual. Let's talk about some more responsibilities of the front line. They're also there because they're the ones that can gain a better, fully understanding of a customer's relationship to your institution. And by that I mean, by talking to the customer, they're going to find out, does the customer have a loan with the bank? Do they have CDs? Do they have a trust relationship? Do they conduct private banking? Do they have a business account, a personal account? that's probably the one person that has the need and probably does look at a customer's overall profile. Now, loan officers probably do, but I know deposit officers don't, or trust officers don't. They just want to find out, for their one office, their one line of business. Where the frontline staff is the one that has an overall idea of what this customer does with my bank in totality. Part of the responsibility of the frontline staff, too, is to upsell products and services the institution provides. So in addition to being an inquisitor to find out all this information, part of your job at the same time is to upsell product. So that's why you've got to use tact and not to appear to be nosy or intrusive. But one of your jobs is to try to upsell products. So that's one of the responsibilities. And another responsibility is to be the conduit between the back office and the customer. So in effect, that means that the frontline staff has to ask all these questions, get all this information so that the back office can use it to develop this profile. And that's why I stress the fact that by the back office and the frontline staff knowing how each operates, what they need, what they do, how they do it, why they do it, it helps both do their job better. So if both understand why gathering information is so important, it makes the overall AML program and process go a whole lot better. Responsibilities can also include providing customer service, which is what they do because they're the conduit, attempting to market more products, and conduct a sales approach. One of the things to make sure of, once again, is don't try to scare the customer when you ask questions. Be conversational and friendly. Don't be accusative. And I always say give examples of why an institution had enforcement actions because they did not gather the information they're required to by law. And I say once again, the regulation clearly says that an institution has to get KYC information, not might or should, but will get name, address, date of birth, and a tax ID number. And what I usually tell people during webinars is if you go online and get some enforcement actions, and have that information close by. When a customer starts giving you a hard time about asking all these questions, you can say, well, we have to do this to protect ourselves because did you know, and by the way, group, this is public information, JP Morgan Chase, Citibank, Wells Fargo had these enforcement actions, and the enforcement action from the government said that the bank did not have an AML program in place where they gathered KYC, where they gathered customer due diligence from information, and where they analyzed that data to file suspicious activity reports. Therefore, they were fined $1 million. Well, once you start telling your customers, hey, here's some examples of why we get this information, it makes them understand a whole lot better. And if you'll go to either the Fed website or the FDIC website or the FinCEN website, FinCEN, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, is the U.S.'s financial intelligence unit, which is where currency transaction reports and suspicious activity reports and other financial documentation go and is analyzed to determine if activity is in fact suspicious. Or if you go to the OCC website, and I give a course, a webinar on enforcement actions, and I go over the specifics of what an enforcement action is and why it's so important. And you'd be amazed, all these big banks that you think are doing the right thing at the right time, how they're not following all the rules and how these fines make absolute sense. So give real examples of why this information is so important. Also, the frontline staff, one of their responsibilities is they can look at a customer's overall history. So they can go in and look and see if this account has had large deposits over time, has it sent wires overseas, has it conducted other kind of activity. So the frontline staff has the ability to go to the computer and analyze a customer's overall activity. And then the last part of responsibilities are going to be the fact that The frontline staff is the one that usually goes into the database and adds notes and adds updates to the information. This day and age with real-time computers, there's a notes section in most of these databases where the frontline staff can add notes about a customer's activity or just any kind of comment that they think the institution needs. And it's the responsibility of the frontline staff, as it is the back office, to have open communication. Who does what, why they do it, what areas, what line of businesses. Just stay in contact so the two groups are aware of what the other one does. And then finally, conduct training with both teams, the frontline staff and the back office. So that way, each side knows what the other one's doing and they can do their job better. This next slide defines what money laundering is. And money laundering, per the FATF, which is the Financial Action Task Force, it says money laundering is the processing of criminal proceeds to disguise their illegal origin. What does that mean? Is anytime a criminal uses the proceeds of a crime for anything, that's considered to be money laundering. So, for example, if somebody kidnaps somebody and gets the ransom, they can be charged with kidnapping because they kidnapped somebody. But if they use the proceeds that they received as ransom for anything at all, then they're charged with money laundering. And if you look at a lot of recent articles in the newspapers about crimes that have been committed, you'll see now that they tack on money laundering as another crime too. So it might say that so-and-so robbed a bank or so-and-so held up somebody. Well, you could charge them with money laundering too, because if they committed a criminal activity and then used the proceeds or money they got from that activity, they can be charged with money laundering. And money laundering is fairly easy to prove, because if you're convicted of kidnapping and you got the ransom and use that money, it's pretty much a no-brainer. Just in case some of you don't know what FATF is the Financial Action Task Force, and it's an international organization that has established recommendations that deal with money laundering issues. And they take the position that if a country, and it's countries, not individual banks or institutions, but if a country follows these recommendations, then they fairly well comply with overall international AML standards. So these 40 standards, these 40 recommendations are things like, does the country have an AML law? Does the country say money laundering is illegal? Does the country have a regulatory regime? Does the country have a financial intelligence unit? So every country is graded by other countries at least once every 4 or 5 years, and they conduct what's called a mutual evaluation. And so you can get the mutual evaluation from the U.S. to see how well we adopt the recommendations. And I'm not going to use the words comply, because the recommendations are recommendations, not a law. But for example, the U.S. on their mutual evaluation kind of got in trouble at the last, well, probably 2 evaluations ago, because we were not real sticklers on obtaining beneficial owner information. States like Delaware and Wyoming allow people to open up companies, and it's not always exactly clear as to who the beneficial owner is. Well, since the U.S. was weak in that aspect, FATF felt that we weren't following their recommendation. I'm not sure if you're aware, but just this last May of 2018, our law, our regulation changed, and the regulation's 31 CFR 103, Chapter X. And they added a section in there in May of 2018, which is kind of surprising because this reg has been around since I know at least 2005. But they finally put it in the regulation that a financial institution has to get the beneficial owner information. In the past, it was just the customer. Well, it wasn't clear that beneficial owners had to also be KYC'd, and so this change to the regulation added the fact that you have to have beneficial owners. So that's just a little bit about what FATF is. An aside, if I was a banker or a financial institution and I had a relationship with a foreign correspondent bank, I would always get that mutual evaluation that FATF published from that country in order to make sure that they were following the rules and regulations. So that's just a side. Let's go to the next slide and talk for a second about structuring. Okay, structuring is one thing that banks get in a lot of trouble about because they don't report structuring when a customer conducts it. But structuring is just trying to evade BSA reporting and record-keeping requirements. And if you read the 3 bullets down there, it says if somebody tries to cause or attempt a bank to not file the CTR, a currency transaction report, that's an issue. Or if they try to get somebody to file one that contains an omission or lack of facts, that can be an issue. Or if they structure or try to structure at one or more banks. So that's one of the major things you're going to see on the low level of money laundering is overall structuring. And I want to point out one more thing about structuring because I always find it kind of interesting. And this is that regulation I talked about, this Chapter X 31 CFR. The regulation itself is 31 CFR 103 Chapter X, but this Section 1010, which was implemented before the Patriot Act, talks about record-keeping requirements. But it talks in the middle there about people now, employees of institutions getting fined. Up until recently, a bank, like I said, was fined for an AML violation. They said, okay, fine, cost of doing business, well, expense it as an expense, not to worry. All is well and good. But now, like I say, it's taken below the line and individuals are now being prosecuted for not having a good AML program in. And I believe, but don't quote me on this, but the first institution that had this happen to them was HSBC. And HSBC had, I'm not sure if it was its risk manager or its AML officer, but that person was fired. And FinCEN, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, said this person could never work in the banking industry again. So I just want to point out what structuring was, just for your information. So let's talk about when and how frontline staff should ask BSA questions. A good time is always when there's a cash transaction over $10,000, because that's when you file a CTR, a currency transaction reports. Now, the law is not real clear about if you file the CTR right there at the front, or you wait to the end of the day and file it, and if you notify the customer about the CTR being filed. Now, SARS, I know, is a no-brainer. SARS, you can't let the customer know you're filing it. But anytime a customer brings in a transaction over $10,000, it should be bank policy that you update their information. And you don't say, hey, I see you're putting in $10,000, that's bad, I'm going to update your information. But you can just say, hey, it's our bank policy to ensure that we understand our customers. Anytime there's a cash transaction, we update your information. And it's very simple. You go online, and the frontline staff does, they call up the customer's account, they just ask, okay, are you still at this address? Do you still have a restaurant? Do you still do this? And just update the information. So that's a good time when you should do it. I'm going to say again, always ask open-ended questions. Don't ask yes or no questions. Don't say something like, did you change your business? And they say yes, and you stop there. You can say something like, I notice you're bringing a lot more cash now. Can you explain, have you increased your business, and what have you been doing lately? Just ask an open-ended question. And another good cover is just say that infamous quote-unquote computer requires an update. How many times have we gotten information from our bank or from somebody else that says, hey, even from your frequent flyer account, say, hey, we're trying to update our information. Can you please provide this information? Well, as a frontline staff, you can look at the customer and say, hey, look, it's every 6 months our customer is programmed to update, our computer's programmed to update information. We need to update your data. Kind of a no-brainer. Most people won't take offense to that because they feel like, well, computers need updating all the time anyway, so let's take care of it. So that's a good time to ask questions. Other information about updating customer information and questions you should ask is always make sure there's a current copy of the ID card on file. I used to get asked all the time as an examiner if an outdated ID card was okay to have in the file. And my answer was no, because it's not a legal document anymore. Once it expires, it's not good anymore. It doesn't work. It's like a passport. It doesn't work anymore. And so what happens with most institutions is they get a picture, a copy of an ID card or a passport, whatever was used for identification, and they put a copy in the file, but they never have a system in place to update that information to make sure it's still current. So I always tell my bankers to always have a copy of the current ID on file. And this last bullet point is, you don't want to make an accusation. You don't want to say, this requires a CTR, therefore I've got to collect information. You can imply that if you want to, but you don't want to come across as saying, oh, you're doing a bad thing here. You're bringing in too much cash. I got to do a CTR on you. And by the way, I want to update your information. That's such a negative vibe. But you can do it a whole lot more conversation. Just say, hey, the law requires I do this. And by the way, since you're here, why don't we update your information? It's a sticky wicket, and some things I say might be contradictory, it seems like, but your job is to make sure that the bank always understands a customer's profile and a customer's anticipated activity. I want to go through a couple of CTR scenarios because it helps, since CTRs are one of the major documents and reports filed by bankers on their customers. If you know when these CTRs are supposed to be filed, that's a good time to ask questions. And I want to stress again, most of the questions you're going to ask as frontline staff is to update the customer's profile, their KYC and their CDD. And just to make sure we're on the same sheet of music, CDD I'm talking about when you find out what kind of business do you have, what's the source of your funds, what's your anticipated activity, what products and services are you going to use, are you going to be sending international activity, do you do trade financing, so you understand what the customer's activity is. But here's a couple of CTR scenarios, and I want you to tell me if it's a yes or a no. A business customer cashes a business check for $26,000, and he takes 12 with cash and puts 14 into his account. Well, that's a no-brainer. Anything 10,000 and a penny to file a CTR. Now, people always ask the question, well, can I file one for a lower amount? Well, the answer is yes, but trust me, FinCEN will probably, and I say probably, never analyze CTRs less than $10,000 just because they get too many of them, unless, of course, it's part of an investigation or else they happen to pick up a pattern. But usually, a small amount like that, and even if you do one or two over your life or over the year, those will never be picked up and reviewed by FinCEN. But by law, you're required to file it for $10,000 and a penny. There's been some speculation that they'll change the law and up this $10,000 to $20,000 because the idea is people don't use cash anymore, they use checks and credit cards, so let's make the threshold be higher. But FinCEN came back and said, no, there's been a lot of tax evasion cases, drug cases, white-collar crime cases that they have picked up through CTRs, so there's no plan to change it to $20,000 from $10,000. But here's another question here, the second bullet. A personal account has a cash withdrawal, the husband and wife, that's the account. So the husband goes to branch A and gets $11,000. Well, right there, immediately, a CTR is filed, immediately. Now, once again, I'm going to say is most institutions file these at the end of the day. They just batch them all up and file them. Very few does a teller take in a cash transaction over $10,000 and then walk and then not file, then go walk and file the CTR. It's usually done at the end of the day because the bank has all the customer's information and they can fill out the CTR. But by definition, if the husband draws out $11,000 out of branch A, a CTR is filed. So if the wife goes and it's a joint account and she takes out $3,000 at branch B, well, a CTR should be filed probably because now it's $14,000. And I always tell my bankers, in abundance of caution, to make sure you file it, even though it's just a $3,000 transaction. In total, it's $14,000, so you got to do it. And the same thing if they take $1,000 out of branch C. Now, one thing too is probably this might be a SAR reportable incident, because why would somebody do this? It doesn't make economic sense. Why didn't you just draw the whole thing out at one time? So yes, a SAR would be filed there. We'll go through 2 more of these and then we'll move on to SARs. Some more CTR transactions. A personal account cash deposit of $4,000 at branch B, A, and 61061 at branch B. Well, of course the CTR is filed because you've got over $1,000, even though it's 2 different branches. Now, in the past, before banks had computer systems that tied everything in, it might be possible for this to happen and nobody catch it for a day or 2. But now everything is real time, so it's got to be done. This last scenario is a business customer deposits $11,000 in cash. Then when they're told about a CTR, they say, oh, on second thought, I'm going to just do $9,000 today and then $2,000 tomorrow. Well, definitely file a CTR because it's both the same amount, and maybe even file a SAR because they purposely structured. To this point, if you're ever interested, there is a money servicing businesses case from about 5 or 6 years ago. Out in California was a money remitter that sent money mostly to South and Central America called Seagate. And I think it's spelled S-E-G-U-E. And Seagate got in trouble because they'd have customers come in with $11,000 cash. And in addition to telling the person that they had to file a CTR, Seagate's employees would say, so therefore, go away and bring in $5,000 today and $4,000 tomorrow. So in effect, the employees of a money servicing business were facilitating structuring and telling the customers how to evade reporting requirements. Therefore, the regulators in FinCEN, when they wrote up their enforcement action and they developed a fine, it was higher than it would have been normally because they felt like these people knowingly and willingly tried to avoid the structuring law. Now you could argue and say, well, it's this little old lady who's sending money back to her family back in some other country. Well, sorry about that. The law is the law, and it's pretty clear if you do this, it's structuring, you're going to have problems. Okay, when do you ask questions? Most institutions do it, like I said before, $10,000. That's because you're doing a CTR. But a lot even do it for $3,000 or more, just because they feel like that $3,000 is a reporting requirement. A lot of times when somebody does official checks or when they do money orders, so they figure that's a good time to ask questions also. And that's when you ask questions like, why are you wiring the money to overseas, and you do it under the guise of, so just in case this gets lost, how can we identify who it's going to and who's sending it, and can we help you in any other way? So you ask any kind of a question. Or if you see wire activity that's inconsistent with due diligence information, and I use my example as the best example, is I never done a wire until I sent that money to Liberia. Well, they asked questions because it wasn't on my due diligence activity. Other times you can ask questions. It's a large check deposit. You can, it's very easy for you as a teller to say, I've noticed in your profile that you never have deposited a check for more than $2,000, yet this one's for $10,000. Anything we should, update your profile? Anything going on? What we should know? Just ask innocuous conversational questions. Other times, if you see unusual activity at the ATM, and the example that most people would give is like, if you see somebody who does a lot of ATM activity and it doesn't make sense, you might ask them when you see them at the teller line next time and say, hey, I see you're doing a lot of ATM activity. Is your card working okay? Are our service hours not good enough for you? You can be as innovative as you want to ask questions, but at the end of the day, you've got to find updated information. Or if you see a questionable ID card, like that ID card you can look at right there, you can't read it. Well, if somebody gave that to you and you can't read it, your question is logically going to be, hey, isn't it about time to get you a new ID card? This one we can't read, we can't really tell, so you can ask information like that. or if somebody has a dormant account or a new account, those are good times to ask questions. You can say, hey, I noticed you haven't done any transactions in the last 6 months. Have you been traveling? Do you have another banking relationship? What's going on? Or if it's a new account, the new account's the best thing because you can always ask questions about, are you new to the neighborhood? Do you like our city? You know, where are you working? That kind of thing. So these are some times of when you can ask the questions. And once again, most of the questions are updated KYC and stuff. Let's talk for a second about SAR scenarios, because if you end up seeing an activity that you think is reportable, the next time you see that customer, you might innocuously again try to update the information so you've got current data on file that you can use when you file a SAR. But for a SAR scenario, something like this one right here is a personal account. Somebody makes a cash deposit of $5,000 on day 1, $5,000 on day 2, and $3,000 on day 3. Then 3 weeks later, they deposit these amounts one day and then the next day. Well, on its face, that looks suspicious. Why would somebody come in with that much cash and in round dollars? Now, they might tell you, well, I own a canoe business and everybody pays me in cash, and I like to get the money out of my business and I'll bring it into you every day. Well, that kind of might make sense. Now, around $5,000, a exact $5,000 amount and a $5,000 and a $3,000, that's kind of sketchy because you'd think that it would be 4,527. So that could be suspicious, but that's why you talk to the customer to find out. It's like, I noticed you made these deposits. Is your business doing well, or is this from your business? Or you can even ask, you know, what's going on, because, you know, I need to clarify. So I would probably file a SAR on this activity if the explanation did not make sense to me. How about a business account that has cash deposits every day for 2 weeks in those ranges? I would probably say, once again, find out from the customer what kind of business they have, if they've been out of town, where the money came from. You know, you have every right to ask where the money came from. And by the way, banks do not have to accept somebody as a customer. Now, you have to do it fairly and equally across the board because of EEO concerns, but you don't have to keep somebody as a customer. So if you have somebody doing something like this and their answers are never any good, in addition to filing a SAR, is you can close out the account and get rid of them. But probably in this thing, I would probably file a SAR. In addition to the fact that it's recurring transactions, it's also round numbers. 2 more SAR scenarios. Somebody has a personal account deposit of $12,000, then does cash withdrawal over the next 4 days. Well, that's suspicious. You know, why would you come in and deposit a check and then immediately take out these different cash things? Remember I told you about that FFIEC BSA examination manual? Well, in the back of that manual, it lists about 10 pages of activity a customer could conduct that are suspicious. And I want to stress, suspicious does not mean bad or illegal. It just means it's not normal for that customer. And one of the things it says is somebody brings in a check and then takes out cash deposits over time. Now, this could make sense. Let's say I'm a good dad. I bring in a personal check for $12,000. Then I want to give each one of my kids some money. So I come in every day, and Joe's in town one day, Sally's in town the next day. So it could make sense. But on its face, that's a little bit suspicious. And then the second bullet point is pretty much a no-brainer, because that last sentence I have in there, not in the due diligence information. So if you see somebody sending outgoing wires to some countries that have, how to say this tactfully, whose mutual evaluations from FATF are not the best, include Pakistan and China. So if you see wires going there, that would be, to me, a red flag, because I know that FATF doesn't think they follow the recommendations very well. The UK, I just do that in just to see if a few are awake or not. But if the stuff is not in the due diligence information, then it's got to be questionable. Some information about asking questions about transactions, what and when. Be conversational, not accusatory. Don't say, you're breaking the law, therefore I got to ask this question. Just be conversational, like my banker is to me. Hey, Tom, you've been traveling lately. I see you got a check now from Kosovo. What's up with that? That's fine. Also, most of us, I assume, go to the same branch where we live, and hopefully by now your frontline staff knows who you are. Mine kind of recognized me now because it's on the corner. But if you as a frontline teller know your customer, you have a pretty good idea of what they're doing and if their lifestyle has changed or if their activities changed. Just kind of keep track of that. Or when you're asking a question, make a joke of it. Like when I brought in the information for this Liberia transfer, their comment was, man, what are you doing in Liberia? That's in Africa. I said, well, yeah, that's where I was working. Or when I brought a check in once from Kosovo, it was all in Cyrillic writing. And so the people said, what is this check here? Well, took like 3 months to clear. But anyway, it was an overseas check. And they asked the question, like, okay, what are you doing with this? And that was their way of making it not be accusatory. Or like I said, too, you're giving good service to the customer. Notice you made a lot of visits to the ATM. Is your card okay? So you're asking questions about this account, but you're making it seem light and not accusing the customer. Or you can also offer other services. Hey, I see, Tom, you're doing wires to Liberia. Are you going to be doing more wires overseas? If so, let's update your profile so we have that information. It's just a great way to do business. Or looking out for the customer. Pretend that you really care about the customer by saying, hey, can I note down that you're who this money order is going to, because in case it gets lost, we can help find it better. Those are some things that you can do as a frontline staff or your bank can do to make it seem like you're not being too accusatory in the questions. Some things to look at when you're asking questions too, like I said previously, is look at the history. Because it's possible, I know, to go into the account on the computer and look at transactions for the last 2 weeks or a month and just see if what's going on now makes sense and if it's reportable. Or if other parts of the bank have entered notations on the account that can explain the activity or can also show flaws in the person's reason. If they kind of give you a song and dance and you can go back at the history and say, no, that doesn't jive with your past history, then that can be a big issue. Other things about considering account history is, at the end of the day, you want to ask the customer, does this transaction make sense? Prime example, my Liberia transaction. I keep going back to that's so out of the norm for me. At first, it didn't make sense. What's this guy doing? Why money to Liberia? But then when I showed him, if they asked, I could have given them a plane ticket. I could have given them my hotel bill. But I had the hotel bill to say, hey, I've got to go pay for this. So after that, the transaction did make sense. Also, if you see recent cash transactions for $3,000 or more, that's something to think about because people just don't use cash that much anymore. Unless, of course, you've got a cash-intensive business, but not too many of us have that. Other things, you want to look at frequent ATM activity. And why do you do that? Mainly because it's not face-to-face, even though, yes, there is a record kept, but it allows a little bit of anonymity because people don't always go back and check all the films. Another thing, like we talked about too, is if you see a large cash check deposit and there are multiple cash withdrawals, if that's what you see in that account on a regular basis, then that's one thing. But if it's new for the account, that could be an issue. Or in general, unusual money order activity. When you see a bad guy come in and he wants to launder money and he buys sequential money orders, that's a problem. Or if somebody comes in and deposits sequential money orders, that can be a problem too. So you want to make sure. Now, I don't think too many people do money orders that much anymore, unless they're sending money to the family somewhere, but that can be an issue that happens. So before I go and discuss a couple of cases that show the pitfalls of not asking questions and not updating information, I just want to reiterate that the whole point of this webinar is just so you feel comfortable asking questions of your customers. You kind of have an idea of when to ask questions. You have a good idea as to why you ask questions, and bottom line, to build the profile and understand the customer's activity. You know, a lot of people have asked after I've done this webinar, well, why don't you give us specific questions to ask? Well, I've given you some, but each instance will be different, and each customer has different activity. At the end of the day, you want to make sure you understand that customer's activity. So any question you have to ask. And if you lose the customer because they ask questions, that might be a good thing, because if they don't want to disclose information to you, maybe they're hiding something. Maybe they're not, but just to protect yourself, you might want to do that. A couple of cases where institutions, and these are all public information I got off the web, is there was a money servicing business called Mayan, and its title was Mayan Inc. DBA Tower Package Store. Well, they also cashed checks and they remitted money out of the country. Well, the law says if you get over 50% of your income from that kind of activity, then you're legally a money servicing business. So when we went in and looked at this place, found out that they were doing that, therefore they were an MSB. Well, it turns out this place, since they were an MSB, had no written program, they never filed a CTR, and they were willfully not following AML guidelines. And just a quick aside to this place, this was a place that I examined once, and the bank did not realize that they were an MSB. They thought they were just a liquor store. So one weekend, I walked in there just being nosy. And sure enough, they did sell liquor, but they also, on the weekends, because I went in on Saturday, they had 4 or 5 machines that they had rolled in that allowed them to transmit money. And they also had 3 or 4 cash registers set up, and they were cashing checks for people. And so it's like a no-brainer. Wait a minute. You say you're a package store, yet you're doing this kind of activity, therefore you are an MSB. These other banks had fines, all of them. Associated Bank out of Wisconsin, New Millennium Stock Exchange is out of Miami, Cash Exchange, Old National Bank is out of Evansville, Indiana. And almost every one of these had problems because they didn't have an AML program. That MSB, that New Millennium Cash Exchange, was not licensed or registered, but the 2 banks, Associated and Old National, in their enforcement action, it clearly says that your AML program was not sufficient. Not that it was weak and could have been improved. No, it was not sufficient because you did not gather information / ask questions of your customers to build the profile. Some other ones on this next page, and all these are really interesting cases. This one place was, this Sarah Adams was also a liquor store, but JP Morgan Chase, and yes, that's $2 billion with a B. And they were fined by FinCEN, the FIU, the OCC, the regulator, the Federal Reserve regulator, and the U.S. Attorney. Talk about Chase for 2 seconds. The OCC fined Chase because they weren't following the regulations, and we have that authority to fine them. Well, FinCEN determined that since they weren't following the regulation, they allowed other people to break the law, and they were breaking the law, so they fined them. Now, all 4 places initially leveled a fine, but they settled for 1 fine. But you can look and see there, all those large banks, TD Bank, yeah, that's TD Bank out of Minnesota, I think it is. But all of them, and the 2 large banks, JP Morgan and TD Bank, had been warned 3 or 4 times during examinations. And the enforcement action will tell you that. They will tell you, you were warned that you were not gaining information to set up a profile 2 or 3 exams ago. We cut you some slack and told you to do it, and you said you would. Well, you didn't, so now we're going to lower the boom. And they were fined really, really lots of money. $2 billion is quite a bit of change. I want to point out in the middle of this paragraph, this is where it points out that a person can be liable. If you'll find the figure of $250,000 or 5 years in prison, the top of that sentence says, for example, a person, including a bank employee, willfully violating BSA is subject to a fine of that much money or 5 years in prison. So it now makes it very clear that a person can be charged. So if you're like a risk officer or an AML officer, or if you're the clerk that doesn't do the right thing or lets somebody do a transaction or something, you can go to prison for it nowadays. And if I was teaching a class at a bank to staff, I'd have this on every other page so everybody understands it. So in summation, the takeaways I want you to remember is build relationships between the front line and the AML back staff, keep open communication, have joint trainings and roundtable, so both sides know what the other one's doing, have different offices visit other offices to see what they do, and if the frontline staff of one of your branches has never been to the headquarters to see how the BSA shop works, another good thing for them to do is to trade jobs. Or give real-life examples like from these enforcement actions. I always stress that. Other things, if you have articles about BSA events, have those published around your institution. Every month or so, there's an article somewhere in a magazine or a newspaper that addresses AML issues that would really help your staff understand it's not just our management, but it's a worldwide event. Other things to do is there are organizations out there. I'm not touting anything or not recommending anything, but there's an organization called ACAMS, Association of Certified Anti-Money Launderers, that they have chapters and events. You can build relationships by going to those and understanding, or you can go to a money laundering task force and find out information from them as to what kind of questions you can ask. So before I turn it over for questions,